The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we are here today on Titans of Nuclear with Ian Hore-Lacy, who's the Senior Advisor to the World Nuclear Association. Ian, welcome to Titans.
Thanks, Brett. Good to be here.
Yeah, no, listen, you're a bit of a legend. I feel like whenever somebody goes to answer something about nuclear on the internet, they inevitably end up at a page that you've written. So you are like the internet's knowledge of nuclear. Is that right?
Oh, well, I've taken great pleasure in just collating information, having a brain that doesn't retain a lot very well, but collating it and organizing it. And yeah, so that's resulted in the information papers, the big range of them on the World Nuclear Association website.
Yeah, it's just so funny because like whenever like I'm talking to like a lay person and they want to ask me something about nuclear, sure enough, they reference that page as like their bait, like when they Googled, like, you know, like how much uranium is there or whatever it is. It's like they always end up on one of those pages. But maybe we can just kind of take a step back. I'd love to just learn a little bit about you. Where did you grow up?
In Australia, near Melbourne mainly, yeah, and then went to university at the University of New England, which has nothing to do with the United States, but it's in the northern part of New South Wales, and did a science degree and got hooked on environmental stuff. And then I spent 2 lots of 3 years doing various youth ministry type of things, then a master's. Then I was a senior biology master at a school for 3 years. And then I saw this magnificent and got very much involved in environmental education at that point. Then I saw this fantastic ad in a newspaper for a company I'd never heard of, but turned out to be one of the 2 biggest mining companies in Australia, wanting an environmental scientist, and the job description was about twice as good as anything I could have dreamed up myself. So I applied for it and somehow got it.
And what mining company was that?
It was called CRA, Consec Rio Tinto, but these days it's just known as Rio Tinto.
Yeah, world famous. And
it was the Australian arm of Rio Tinto. And I was the first environmental scientist, head office role, that is to say, processing information rather than out on the ground, making things grow. And so I got involved with a whole lot of stuff about, biological area, which of course is my own for revegetation, but also pollution control. And I was so excited by all this that I wrote a book called Mining and the Environment, which was a huge success. Many copies printed and sent around to shareholders in particular, about an 80 or 90 page book. And then the chairman, the chief executive of the company called me in and said, look, this book's been a great success, but look, the nuclear debate in Australia, and this was 1978, the nuclear debate in Australia is going nowhere. People are talking past one another from either side. I want you to write a book on nuclear power, and chapter 1 will be about energy, chapter 2 will be about electricity, chapter 3 will be about this. And he sort of laid it out and said, wow. I said, that's a great idea, Rod. But I wanted to sort of be comprehensive so that anybody looking at arguments for one side or the other can relate them to some facts. Yep. And I said, that's a great idea, Rod, but I don't know the first thing about nuclear power. And he said, well, that's right. Ron Hubery over here who'd been with the company for some years, knows all about it. He'd been at uranium mines and also with the Atomic Energy Commission. He'll help you. And so we teamed up and became firm friends. And the first edition of a book called Nuclear Electricity was published in 1978. And the 11th edition of the same book, but with a new title, was published in 2018, 40 years later.
Wow.
That's nuclear power in the world today.
And how much of what went into these papers and this book, how much of it was just kind of pulling out of your colleague's head versus you having like kind of pressure test what you heard and fact check and like, how did you fact check? Like, what was your research methodology?
Well, the first edition of the book, it mainly came out of Ron Huber's head with a bit of research. But subsequent edition, he was a co-author for about the first 3 editions. After that, he then retired, and I was then on my own. So I just learned to, survey the literature and work out what was going on. And you soon develop a sense of what's reliable and what isn't, and you follow up smoke down to the fire, and other stuff you completely ignore. So you get a sense of how to research, and that's, of course, then flowed on into later on. I stayed with the company in other roles than the environmental role for some years. But then in 1993, I think it was, or 94, I started, took over the running of the Uranium Information Centre in Melbourne. And that was an Australian entity, which was set up and funded by the uranium mining companies, but its focus was on nuclear power. In other words, it was to sort of show what this stuff that was being mined in Australia was actually used for, and a sort of part of their social license, I guess, to have this information publicly. And I then sort of focused on that strongly and increased my research, personal research abilities. And then in 2001, and I sort of had more and more to do with the Uranium Institute in London, which is now known as the World Nuclear Association. And when John Rich...
I thought that was the history of WNA. Interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it changed its name in 2001. John Rich took over in 2001. It had been staggering a bit up till the last few years up till then. And John conscripted me and said, look, how quickly can you move to London, basically? And so my role with the UIC in Australia sort of progressively merged with a role based in London for the World Nuclear Association. And to some extent, I continue in that, except that I sort of really retired about 3 or 4 years ago and handed over to a successor, but I'm still part-time.
And yeah, that's the other thing I was going to ask you, like, how much of, like, if you were to kind of like think about back to, your environmental, scientist days, as you start to pick up kind of the nuclear information aspect of your career, like how much of it like was your day job over the course of your career? It started off as like 10% and then became 100. Like, what was it ever your full-time thing, just looking into nuclear information?
The last 25 years has been, yes.
Just nuclear.
Since about 1994.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been full time, but before that, it wouldn't have even been 10% on average.
And how many things after you became full time, and like, how much of the stuff did you have to go back and readdress? Like, how much stuff that you had originally written about it, originally thought about it when you were only part-time on it, as you became like a world expert and had decades to acquire more information? How many things had to be changed, and what were they?
Nothing had to be changed radically at all. But everything was sort of updated and upgraded as my understanding progressed. For instance, I started out with no knowledge of nuclear physics and had to get my mind around that as a biologist.
And what about radiation? I'm very curious about radiation, because this seems to be an issue of huge contention within the nuclear space, how people feel about either the linear no threshold ALARA and its role on the industry. What about that topic?
Well, that was certainly right at the outset. That was an issue. One of the 3 or 4 sort of issues, I guess, that people were concerned about with nuclear power. So yes, I've got my mind around that pretty much. And again, my understanding hasn't changed since that first edition of the book, 45 years ago.
And what is it? Maybe just you can kind of weigh in on the whole debate for me about linear no threshold versus a threshold. Are the radiation standards appropriate or inappropriate?
I think they're over the top in many cases. I mean, we're all subject to radiation in small amounts naturally. And in some parts of the world, people are naturally subject to vastly more. If you live in Colorado, I guess, in the States, also in certain parts of India and Iran and South America, you're subject to almost 50 or 100 times more, and there's no adverse effects from that visible in epidemiologically. So I think that the figures that are suggested by people who studied this carefully, that up to about 100 millisieverts per year is not going to hurt anybody, whereas we're mostly subject to 1/50th of that.
And as a world expert, I mean, have you ever been called in to meet with the regulators or international radiation standards bodies to explain this to them?
No, because I'm not an expert. I'm a scientific generalist, and I'm a person that writes about these things. So I don't profess any personal expertise in relation to any of the things I write about.
Yeah, but as being one of the most well-read and well-researched person, I have to call you an expert. I mean, that's maybe you didn't conduct scientific studies yourself, but I certainly put you in the category of people who are most knowledgeable in the sector.
Well, most knowledgeable is one thing, maybe, but that's because I'm drawing on experts and collating and assessing what they say and writing it up, which is a different thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift gears to Australia a little bit. What's going on in Australia? Why is nuclear a debate, especially if there's a healthy uranium mining industry? How come they haven't been able to lobby for better public opinion?
Well, a good question. Australia has no nuclear organisation that is capable of lobbying for nuclear power. It is the only, the only country of its size and kind, I suppose, without a nuclear advocacy organisation. Now, that is partly filled by the Minerals Council, and the Minerals Council just today, for instance, is releasing a small book on small modular reactors, which is quite expertly written by a fellow named Ben Hurd, whom I'm sure you've heard of.
Of course, Ben Hurd, a former Titan on our show.
Yep, well, he's a very capable guy. Again, he's not an expert in the sense that we've just been discussing, but he is a very very knowledgeable guy who's done a fairly expert job in writing this book and researching all the economic as well as other aspects of it. So there's the Minerals Council is the only body, and of course there is the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, which is a government body, but it is forbidden to be a lobby group. But just going back beyond that, the reason that nuclear power hasn't come to the fore in Australia is mainly that we are very well endowed with high quality coal, which is very conveniently situated around where it's needed in terms of the capital cities. I guess I'd say in Victoria it's low quality brown coal, but the point is there's plenty of it, and it's cheap, and there's no sulfur emissions hardly from it, and therefore this has underwritten our prosperity to a very large extent. There's been no reason until concerns about global warming to go nuclear.
And yeah, how are your energy costs? But I thought I heard sometimes that there are blackouts, or is this just a recent thing? So what's the energy infrastructure like today in Australia?
Well, we're about 2/3 of our electricity comes from coal nationally. South Australia has not got a lot of coal. In fact, it's hardly got any, and stopped mining the rubbishy stuff that they were using. And it's tried to sort of go very renewables, and it's had a statewide blackout a couple of years ago. But otherwise, we've done better than most people with regard to blackouts. But of course, that we can't rely on that, because national policies are to subsidise renewables, intermittent renewables. We've got very little hydro. And to close down coal progressively, which is going to put us in a horrible dilemma unless somebody bites the bullet on developing nuclear power here. And that is getting close, I think.
Yeah, okay. I want to get to that and your take on where things are headed. But before that, I just want to come back to why no nuclear to begin with. I understand you have coal, and that it was easy and cheap and reliable. Okay. But that's still not a reason to like forbid nuclear in the law, right? But there is like a law against it, isn't there?
There are two laws that bear upon it, and that just comes down to political horse trading in Canberra.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll, with Greens' pressure, of course. Yes, we'll put this in because it doesn't matter in the short term, in order to get something else through on some other industrial relations, I think, was the trade-off.
But why were the Greens even why was that even an issue for them? If the country has never had it, there aren't even that many countries around. I don't think there are any countries around it that have really had. I guess Japan is close-ish, maybe. Why was it even a card for political horse trading at all?
Good question. It's an ideological question. It's partly related to nuclear weapons, but not as closely related as, say, it is in the UK. It just got up. I mean, the Australian Conservation Foundation is the largest green group in Australia, and actually I briefly worked for them. But early on in the 1960s, they published a booklet advocating nuclear power. But by the 1970s, that had changed, and they became strongly anti-nuclear. But it's an ideological question, basically.
Yeah. I guess I'm afraid that's true. It's just that simple. It's ideological. There's no real rhyme or reason for it.
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about the future. It's like, okay, so Ben Hurd's out there fighting the good fight. There are a couple other entrepreneurs I've even heard in Australia that want to make something happen. What's created this shift? I mean, I guess climate change, obviously you look at the solutions and you say, well, we need stable base load, dispatchable power that's carbon free. I guess there's really only one option. That's one thing that puts it on the plate. But what has to happen now, literally, logistically, to get the country on board? Does a law need to be passed? And how do you even pass a law?
Well, the two federal laws need changing. Very minor change, just deleting about one line of text in each. That's the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Act, and also one on environmental protection. But those are the two federal laws which forbid any government body seriously looking at nuclear power, basically. Yeah. So that's in one sense a detail, and there is starting to be public opinion in Australia which would definitely support that legal amendment. But I think that the general feeling on the sort of conservative side of politics is that this has to be a bipartisan exercise.
Mm.
And the current leader of the opposition is from the strong left side of that party, and he is trenchantly opposed, although he did concede the other day when this new pact Australia, UK, USA, AUKUS defence pact, which involved nuclear powered submarines.
Yeah.
He did nod to that. He was brought in on that, and he said, yes, look, that's okay, just on a couple of conditions. And one of the conditions was that it didn't mean that the country would embrace nuclear power. So he's still got to come down from that, and so, until he moves on or changes his mind, I don't see the government finding an easy path forward. On the other hand, it may decide to move regardless in the light of emerging or evolving public opinion. It may decide to move in a way that sort of wedges the opposition, because there are plenty of people in the Labor Party who are pro-nuclear.
And what is causing that shift in public opinion? Is this global public opinion that's shifting more positively towards nuclear, or is it Australian public opinion for some reason is shifting more positively towards nuclear?
Well, I can't speak about global. I'm not tuned in enough, but it is Australian public opinion. And I think it's mainly driven by the strong popularity in Australia of doing something about global warming, about reducing CO2 emissions. A lot of discussion about this sort of net zero by 2050 type of idea.
Yep.
And while you in the US and the UK can talk about perhaps net zero by 2050 with a good deal of optimism, but you're both starting with 20% nuclear. Australia's starting with 0% nuclear. So we have absolutely zero chance of getting anywhere near 20% net zero by 2050 without a large slab of nuclear such as you've got.
And so is that really it? Is it really that the climate-oriented policymakers are looking at the energy landscape and actually just coming to the logical conclusion, hey, we need nuclear? Because sometimes in the US, I feel like some people, at least in my community, say, yes, we need nuclear. It's a no-brainer, obviously. But a lot of people just say, well, we'll just do wind and solar and we'll just make it work. We'll just add as much storage as necessary. We'll just make it work. We'll imagine that storage will become cheaper. We'll imagine it'll be easier all around. We're just going to imagine by 2050 it'll work. How come your policy leaders just don't imagine?
They do. The policy leaders are exactly on that wavelength.
Okay.
And it's pure fantasy.
Yeah.
And it's pure fantasy, and that's why
But you're saying it's the average person. The average person is actually coming to the conclusion that that nuclear is necessary, looking at the climate situation.
Yeah, well, I think people are seeing, that there have been some big batteries built in Australia, and they've been very successful, but mainly in frequency control ancillary services.
Right, of course.
Not in storing energy. They're helping to make the intermittent renewables work, but they're very expensive, and to think of storing a week's worth of electricity for the country in those is just pure fantasy.
Yeah,
now, so I think the penny's dropping there, but officially the expert bodies in terms of running the energy policy have not articulated the nuclear word yet.
Yeah.
I think it'll come.
And then so talk me through the progression. So first, the politicians have to be convinced. Then they have to vote and delete those two lines in the laws. And then what needs to happen? Does the government need to get involved in procuring nuclear infrastructure? Do private companies just jump in and deploy small modular reactors or something else? Or how do you see it playing out?
Well, I think that the government is not going to invest in energy plants, in electricity generating plants, because virtually the whole of the electricity provision in Australia is privatised. So it's a question of the government's making available whatever incentives it may to encourage private investment, and that may be, and that then gets complicated because it's really the same situation in the States. You've got sort of half your states that are have merchant plants, sort of selling into a liberalised market, deregulated market. And the other half, of course, are cost plus arrangements. So we're in the first category. So you've then got to sort of look at some way of having, some long-term assurance for electricity prices. Yeah. And this is exactly the same problem that the UK government is wrestling with. They've tried to do it one way with the Hinkley Point plant on contracts for difference. That's produced a rather high and forbidding figure. And they're now looking at regulated asset base so that you actually share the risk around everybody. So that's the other thing, that there's got to be some modification of the electricity marketing in Australia to allow for investment in fairly high capital cost plant.
And what about selling straight to industry? Is it possible to skip over the electricity market reform and just have that same long-term price guarantee just with a private company, perhaps even a uranium mine site?
Oh yes, well that's definitely possible, but probably not so much uranium mine site, but the bigger iron ore mines, which use a lot of energy. But yes, look, there are those possibilities. There's a lot of talk at the moment about hydrogen production, and of course that's green hydrogen. But once you start looking at green electricity anyway, which is intermittent, and and then applying that to expensive electrolyzers producing hydrogen, using nuclear power for that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of sort of visionary discussion, rhetoric about exporting, Australia becoming a hydrogen exporter.
Oh, very interesting. And then tell me more about how you've seen kind of the various technologies playing out. If you were to kind of be on an advisory panel of some sort as to who should be coming into the Australian market with what nuclear technologies, what would you advise?
I'd say it's very confusing. I mean, there are just so many designs of small reactors out there. But look, all the discussion in Australia at the moment is around small modular reactors. Okay. All of it.
And when you say small modular reactors, is this of the standard light water reactor variant, or could this be an advanced new moderator, new coolant technology as well?
Yes, it could be, but it doesn't get that specific. But I wouldn't rule out some large plants. It's just a question of siting them. Yeah. And there'd be the not in my backyard syndrome, loud and clear. But look, there's certainly scope for some larger plants. But the main thinking is under 300 megawatts.
Yeah, where are your coal plants located right now? Are they close to the cities, or are they kind of a little further inland?
Oh no, they're mostly within 100 kilometers of the cities.
Yeah.
And they're on coal fields.
They're on coal fields, yeah. But are they how close are they to the city? Like, could one make the argument that you could just kind of replace coal infrastructure with even large scale nuclear, and it's just like not in the middle of the city, so that gives people a little out from the not in my backyard perspective?
Yes, you could do that, and that's certainly been talked about, and it would do that. But the logic, Australia's got a lot of coastline, as you would have observed, and most people live near the coast. So it would make more sense, to my way of thinking, to put any large plants, or even the small ones for that matter, on the coast, and use seawater cooling through the condenser circuit. Right. At the moment, the nearly all the coal-fired plants, all but about 2, I think, use potable water for cooling. So they're evaporating a vast amount of water for cooling. And the reason that they do that is because they're not on the coast, they're on the coalfields. But the point is, if you replace those with plants that use seawater cooling, you'd save about 2/3 of Melbourne's water supply, in effect. And Melbourne's a city of about, what, 4 or 5 million.
How come they use potable water and they don't use like wastewater? You know what I'm saying? Like Arizona, you know, the plants in Arizona do, where it's just like instead of the sewage kind of going into the ocean or wherever people dump sewage, you know, why don't they, you know, feed it over to the wastewater treatment plant right next to the power plant and use that water to evaporate?
Oh, well, I think it's just that there is potable water available for each of these, and putting the city sewerage in that direction would be quite a major exercise. And nobody's, I think, really thought about it.
Yeah.
And they're certainly not thinking about it now, because all the thinking and discussion is about closing these plants, coal-fired plants, down anyway.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because, like, I'm a big fan of the small modular reactors. I think that's probably how the industry is going to have to rebuild itself. But, you know, I'm a little conflicted also, because I look at the history of how we used to build the large plants, and they were so cost effective, and they built them so quickly, like on time, under budget. It's like, you know, when you go back far enough, when you go back to the 60s, not to the 70s, 80s, when you go back to the 60s in the US, at least, maybe 70s in France and Sweden. So, like, how do I reconcile this? Like, the fact that, why can't we just do what we did then, build 100 gigawatt scale reactors, or half a gigawatt scale? They used to build them like 500 megawatts, let's say. Okay, fine. Why can't we just do exactly what we did then? I still don't know how to answer that question. What are your thoughts?
There's an MIT study which is interesting, and it shows over 25, 30, 40 years, 50 years, maybe 40 years, I think, the relative cost or the relative labor productivity between factories and large plants being built on site, like those big plants. And the graphs have diverged. The labor productivity in factories has gone up over that period, and the labor productivity on site has gone down. And that's why those plants are less commercially, economically viable to build today, according to this study.
And how is that possible? Okay, I know now we're getting out of nuclear world, but, like, how is it possible that labor productivity in field goes down when I see, like, really sophisticated modern equipment on construction sites today? You know, like I bet that the computer controls and the extra instrumentation and the tablets that the construction guys have, that they're communicating with each other, like, I bet that stuff should make them more productive than it made them in the 1960s, not less. So what's going on there?
I don't really know.
And, like, other things should be cheaper too, right? It's like the cost of a bobcat or a crane, or all of those things should have gone down over time, not up. Like, it's like the equipment usage should be cheaper too.
Yeah, I think it's partly related to unions. It's partly related to OHS. It's partly related to
What's OHS? Occupational health and safety.
Yes. Okay. Occupational health and safety, and also the amount of regulation, particularly in the States. Yeah. I mean, the contrast between now and 40 years ago in the States, I gather, the proportion of people on the staff of a nuclear plant, and this presumably goes back to also building it, who are purely sort of filling in paper in a regulatory sense rather than producing electricity, has changed remarkably, I gather.
Yeah.
So, but just come back to the small modulars. The fact, if you've got a factory, there's often more flexibility with regard to the labour that you can employ. And all those sort of technological gizmos you just mentioned apply even more so in a factory. Yeah. And this comes back to the earlier question about where we might go in Australia. this little book produced by Ben Hurd, or produced by the Minerals Council and written by Ben Hurd, looks at three possible reactors. You asked about what type. One is the NuScale, which is a PWR. The other is the BWRX 300 from GE Hitachi, which is a boiling water reactor.
Yeah,
and
they gotta get better at naming stuff.
Yeah, and then they've got the IMSR, which is a molten salt reactor.
From who?
Which
Who makes
is
the IMSR?
Terrestrial, I think, might be
Okay,
terrestrial.
Yep, that makes sense.
Or yeah. Anyway, it's and it's much more innovative, whereas NuScale and the BWRX are very well proven technology. I mentioned those three are the ones that feature in this book, which will presumably now be a focus of attention in Australia. But you've got two other rather important innovations overseas. One is the Russian Ritm 200 reactor, which is a 50 megawatt unit, basically. And that does come integral, and that does come as a unit from the factory. And you can look at a photo of it on a rail car. I've got a photo of one of these.
I think it's genius. I think they're pioneering one of the best paths forward. Why aren't other countries doing that too? I guess China maybe is also. Well,
China, the ACP 100 is possibly similar. I don't know enough about. Well, yes, it is relatively similar. But the other interesting one in China is the one that started up about 2 weeks ago, the HTR-PM. That's a high temperature gas cooled pebble bed reactor. And that sort of comes in two parts from the factory. The reactor unit, which is it's actually two 200 megawatt reactors driving a 200 megawatt turbine. But so it I think will, again, the photographs I've got of the actual hardware suggest that it would fit on a railway wagon quite happily, all the separate pieces, and just have to be connected on site. So I think that's going to be a modular thing in the same sort of way as we're talking about.
Yeah.
Then there's the ACP 100, which is a pressurized water reactor.
I love the Russian design, the kind of like the barge design. I guess because they had the icebreaker thing already, which was kind of similar too, just kind of like a small pressurized water reactor. Why don't the French just copy that? Like, shouldn't EDF just look at it, copy it? Like, they invest so much in these giant projects. They need an export economy anyway. They can't sell you guys submarines because, we won. Why don't they just build a bunch of, floatable little nuclear stations copying the Russian design?
Well, there is a French design that is comparable. I've forgotten what they call it at the moment, but there is one, yes.
Oh, okay. So they do have something, but they're just not selling it anywhere?
Well, no, they haven't actually built it yet, but it's related to their naval reactors, but not the same. It has a particular name, but I just can't think of it at the moment.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So we've covered a few different technologies. We've got your perspective now. You think that SMRs are kind of dominating the Australian talking points, but you're not against the big ones either. And so you're pretty optimistic about things changing in the next couple of years?
Yes, I think I am now much more optimistic than I was 6 months ago, and mainly because of this deal with nuclear-powered submarines. That's suddenly, I think broken people's, taken people out of the rut that they've got into in their thinking, put it that way. Hey, look, and if we're going to have nuclear-powered submarines, why on earth are we rabbiting on about net zero by 2050 and not having the appropriate technology to get there? In terms of power generation.
That makes sense. Okay, so you think that's what's going to switch the narrative? That's pretty interesting. What else would you like to see people do? People who are listening to this, other of your fellow countrymen, what do you want the average person to be doing on a day-to-day basis to help bring nuclear to Australia?
Oh, look, I think just looking at the other applications for industrial heat, and the whole question of hydrogen, I think, has a big question mark over it in terms of its viability and cost, not to mention the difficulties of transporting it. But that's all a very, very interesting question. And that's something I've given a bit of time to. This is the sort of way in which I'm backing up my successor in London, who you probably should also interview, Alec Mitchell. But you know, where there's a need to pull together a whole lot of information into a fresh information paper, and with hydrogen, there's a lot of stuff to pull together. That's the sort of task I've been able to devote myself to, undistracted by the routine updating that Alec does. I mean, of those 160 information papers, probably 5 or 10 are updated every week to some degree. I don't mean wholly rewritten. I mean just up-to-date information dropped into them.
Yeah.
That's a big job for him. And so when there's something extraneous, like the new hydrogen paper, that's the sort of thing that he'll chuck to me, which was a very interesting challenge, because particularly it's not just a matter of how you generate your hydrogen, how you produce your hydrogen, also the many, many ways in which you can use hydrogen. Wow. In a sort of a zero carbon environment. And also the different ways of transporting it to make it into ammonia, particularly. And you either then burn the ammonia as a fuel, or you sort of crack the ammonia after it's been transported halfway around the world back into hydrogen, to feed into your gas network or whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah, I think hydrogen is also very interesting. I'm wondering, as you've done your research, have you found, so let's say that you're creating it from through electrolysis. You've already got the advantages doing it from nuclear instead of intermittent sources, because you get to run your equipment, you know, full power, same rate all the time. So there's huge cost advantages there. But then what about the heat? Because nuclear energy starts off as heat before you even create the electricity. Can you use that heat at a higher efficiency to get the water molecules to a better state to break them apart? Is that part of this? I've heard of high temperature electrolysis, but I don't know. Has anyone actually done it? Does it work? Does it make sense?
Oh yes, it does work, but it's only really on a laboratory scale so far. And you've got the solid oxide sort of catalytic thing, so you're actually electrolyzing steam in effect. So yes, that's imminent, I would say, an imminent commercial technology. But you then, of course, go from there, and you've got direct thermochemical production of hydrogen using the iodine sulfur process, or a couple of alternatives, but the iodine sulfur is the front runner at the moment. And that means you need heat at about 950 degrees Celsius. Oh, okay. And you directly produce hydrogen from water thermochemically, without electrolysis. But the intermediate stage is high temperature electrolysis.
Got it. Okay, very interesting stuff. As we wrap up here, are there any kind of just final thoughts you want to leave our audience with?
No, just that I think to be just very optimistic about having nuclear technology is there. It has so many applications, and to just work away at calming people's fears and misapprehensions down, and working against what is really a campaign of misinformation about it, that is really insidious and really damaging, and you get that turning up in all sorts of places that just make you despair really of people's rationality in terms of listening to it or publishing it.
Well, I'm with you. I think nuclear's got a very bright future. So Ian Hore-Lacy, thank you so much for joining us today on Titans of Nuclear.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time. Bye.
and initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.